"He is not coming." The words spoken by her own father were not a thunderclap. They were a quiet drop of acid, dissolving the floor beneath her feet. Aurelia Finch stood at the back of St. George's, a ghost in ivory silk. The scent of lilies and beeswax, meant to be the perfume of her triumph, turned sick and funereal in the air. Every eye in the nave was a pinprick, a tiny wound in her skin. She could feel them, hundreds of them, all fixed on the bride with no groom. Her father, Mr. Finch, a man whose spine was made of commerce and social ambition, looked not at her, but at the empty space where Viscount Sterling should have been. His face was a mask of grey stone. A messenger arrived, from his mother, of course. Lady Sterling, a woman who appraised Aurelia's worth with the cool, dismissive glance of a jeweler inspecting a flawed diamond. The flaw, of course, was her left leg, which had never quite healed correctly after a riding accident when she was 10. It gave her a slight rolling limp, a permanent imperfection in a world that worshipped seamless perfection. What did it say? Aurelia's voice was a thread of sound, barely audible over the rustle of her own gown. Her father's jaw tightened. He would not repeat it. He did not need to. The collective gasp that had rippled through the pews moments before was explanation enough. A public decree, a judgment delivered before God, and the entirety of the ton. Unfit, damaged, not worthy of the Sterling name. She did not cry. The tears were frozen somewhere deep inside her, a glacier in her chest. All she felt was a profound, hollow coldness. She looked down the aisle, past the rows of perfectly coiffed heads and gaping mouths, to the altar. The space where she was supposed to have pledged her life was now a stage for her humiliation. The sunlight filtering through the stained glass seemed to mock her, painting the marble floor in jewels she would never wear. Her limp, usually a quiet companion, felt like a shackle. Every step she had taken down this aisle, leaning just so on her father's arm to disguise the unevenness of her gait, had been a fool's errand. She had thought love, or at least the respectable imitation of it offered by the Viscount, could render it invisible. Instead, he had held it up to the light for all to see, turning her private burden into a public spectacle. "We must go," her father muttered, his hand a vice on her arm. He was already calculating the cost, the sheer, unmitigated disaster of it, the lost alliance, the squandered dowry, the shame that would cling to their name like soot. He turned her around, away from the altar, away from the future that had just evaporated. The walk back down the aisle was a gauntlet. The whispers were like stones, small and sharp. She kept her chin high, a trick she had learned long ago. If you pretend you cannot hear them, sometimes you can almost believe it. Her gaze was fixed on the great wooden doors at the end of the church, a portal back to a life that was now irrevocably broken. The weight of her dress, the fine silk and delicate lace, felt like a shroud. Each step was a labor. The slight drag of her left foot was no longer a secret, a minor note in the symphony of her movements. It was a drumbeat, thump, drag, announcing her failure to the world. When they finally broke free into the sharp London air, the crowd outside scattered like startled pigeons. Carriages were already being called, the guests fleeing the scene of the accident as if disgrace were a contagion. Her mother was already in their carriage, her face buried in a handkerchief, her shoulders shaking with sobs of pure, selfish mortification. Aurelia did not join her. She stood on the pavement, the cold seeping through the thin soles of her satin slippers, and looked at the chaos she had become. She was no longer Aurelia Finch, the clever girl who read Greek and loved the scent of old books. She was the woman left at the altar, the cripple, the story that would be gleefully retold in every drawing room from Mayfair to Chelsea for the rest of the season. The Finch carriage door was held open for her, an invitation into a suffocating box of familial shame. Her father was gesturing impatiently, but Aurelia could not move. To get into that carriage was to accept her fate, to be taken home and hidden away like a cracked vase, a permanent resident of the shadows. No, the word was silent, but it was the first solid thing she had felt all day, a small, hard kernel of defiance in the vast emptiness of her despair. It was then that the second carriage appeared. It was not a gaudy, fashionable thing, but a behemoth of black lacquer and dark, unadorned crests. It moved with a gravitas that parted the remaining traffic like a ship of the line. The horses were magnificent, 4 black stallions whose breath plumed in the cool air. They came to a stop directly in front of her, their presence so immense and unexpected that it silenced the remaining street noise. A footman in severe black and silver livery disembarked. He moved with an unnerving precision, ignoring her father, ignoring the spectacle, and approached her as if she were the only person on the street. He carried a heavy cream-colored envelope sealed with a forbidding black wax crest, a wolf's head, Blackwood, the Duke of Blackwood, Alistair Beaumont, a man spoken of in whispers, a recluse, a widower of immense wealth and sorrow who had buried his wife 5 years ago and had barely been seen in London since. He was a creature of myth, a northern Titan who ruled his domain from a fortress of grief. What could he possibly want with her? The footman bowed. Lady Aurelia Finch, His Grace the Duke of Blackwood, sends his compliments, and his carriage. Her father stepped forward, his face a bewildered mess of confusion and suspicion. What is the meaning of this? The Duke does not know my daughter. The footman's gaze did not waver from Aurelia. His Grace is aware of the day's events, sir. He extends this invitation to the lady. The letter will explain. He offered the envelope. Her hand, when she raised it, trembled slightly. The paper was thick, expensive. She broke the seal. The handwriting inside was strong, black, and devoid of flourish. It was not a letter of condolence. It was a contract. Lady Aurelia, I have heard what was done to you today. I find the actions of Viscount Stirling and his mother to be a stain upon the honor of the peerage. Men of quality do not discard women for imperfections they cannot control. They value strength, which you have shown. I am a widower with 3 sons. They require a mother. My house requires a duchess. I require a partner of intelligence and fortitude. You require sanctuary. You require a name so powerful it will silence all whispers. You require a life beyond the ruin they have attempted to visit upon you. This is not a proposal of love. It is a proposal of mutual benefit. I offer you my name, my protection, and my title. Marry me. Become the Duchess of Blackwood. In return, I ask that you be a mother to my boys and a chatelaine to my home. My carriage will take you north to my estate should you accept. A special license will be waiting. We will be married upon your arrival. The choice is yours. Remain in London and be their victim, or come to Blackwood and be my Duchess. Alistair Beaumont, Duke of Blackwood. She read it twice. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of it stole the air from her lungs. He was not offering pity. He was offering a fortress, a shield, a new identity forged in the heart of her public destruction. He had seen her greatest humiliation and called it strength. He had seen her flaw and dismissed it as irrelevant. She looked from the letter to the waiting carriage. It was a black box, a mystery. It could be a tomb or a throne. She looked at her father's carriage, where her mother's weeping was a promise of a life sentence of whispered reproaches and closed curtains. There was no choice at all. Aurelia, you will not, her father hissed, grabbing her arm again. You will come home. We will weather this. This is madness. She pulled her arm from his grasp. For the first time she met his eyes directly, and he flinched from the cold fire he saw there. You would have had me marry a man who valued me less than a horse with a bad leg, she said, her voice low and steady. You would have me return to your house to be reminded of that fact every day. No, father, I will not. She turned back to the footman. She held the letter in her hand like a weapon. Please inform His Grace that I accept his offer. The footman bowed again, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Respect, perhaps. He opened the carriage door. The interior was dark, lined with deep blue velvet that swallowed the light. It smelled of leather and rain and cold northern air. She took a step. Her limp was there, the familiar companion. But it did not feel like a weakness. It felt like the engine of her escape. It was the reason Stirling had cast her out, and it was the reason the Duke had seen her. She did not look back at her father's stunned face, or at the gossips on the corner, or at the church where her old life had been immolated. She folded the Duke's letter, placed it in the small reticule that hung from her wrist, and stepped into the darkness of the carriage. The door closed with a solid, definitive thud, shutting out the world. The carriage lurched forward, its powerful motion a promise of distance. She was no longer Lady Aurelia Finch, the jilted bride. She was a woman on her way to become a duchess, driving straight into the heart of a legend. The journey north was a passage between worlds. For 3 days, the carriage rolled relentlessly onward, leaving the manicured fields of the south for the wild, brooding landscapes of the north. Aurelia slept and woke to the rhythmic drumming of hooves and the creak of leather. She ate the simple, hearty food packed for her, her appetite returning with a surprising fierceness. The silken wedding dress was a ridiculous costume. On the first evening, at a quiet inn where the Duke's men had secured a private suite for her, she had bundled it up and left it in a corner. She changed into her plainest traveling dress, a deep grey wool that felt like armor. She left the Viscount's gaudy engagement ring on the mantelpiece beside the discarded gown. She was shedding her old skin. She did not allow herself to think too much about the man she was traveling to meet, the Duke of Blackwood. His letter was her only guide, and it was a document of stark pragmatism, not romance. He had not rescued her out of chivalry. He had made a strategic acquisition. He needed a duchess, and she, a woman publicly ruined, was available for a bargain price. There was a brutal honesty to it that she found strangely comforting. After the cloying lies of the London season, this felt real. Still, fear was a constant low hum beneath the surface of her calm. What kind of man commanded such loyalty and moved with such swift, decisive power? What kind of father needed to import a mother for his children? The whispers about him painted a picture of a grim, sorrowful giant locked away in his castle like a beast from a fairy tale, and she was walking willingly into his lair. On the fourth day, the landscape changed again. The hills grew steeper, clad in heather that was a deep, bruised purple. Stone walls, grey and ancient, crisscrossed the land. The air was colder, cleaner, smelling of damp earth and pine. This was his kingdom. The carriage turned off the main road onto a private drive that plunged into a dense, dark forest. The trees were so thick they blotted out the afternoon sun, creating a perpetual twilight. Then, as they rounded a final bend, the forest fell away, and she saw it. Blackwood Manor was not a manor, it was a fortress. It rose from the earth as if it were part of the stone itself, a sprawling edifice of dark grey granite, its towers and battlements stark against the churning sky. It was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure, a place built to withstand sieges, not to host tea parties. This was the home of the wolf. The carriage clattered across a stone bridge over a rushing white water river and into a vast courtyard. The moment it stopped, the great oak doors of the keep swung open. A woman stood there, ramrod straight, her silver hair pulled into a severe bun. She wore a black dress and a face that looked as if it had been carved from the same granite as the castle. The footman opened the door. "Her Grace, the Duchess of Blackwood," he announced to the waiting woman, though Aurelia was not yet a duchess. It was a statement of intent. Aurelia gathered her courage. She stepped out of the carriage, her limp more pronounced after the long journey. She felt the woman's eyes on her, a sharp, assessing gaze that missed nothing, especially the unevenness of her gait. "I am Mrs. Gable," the woman said, her voice crisp. "The housekeeper. His Grace is waiting for you in his study." She did not offer a welcome. She simply turned and led the way. Aurelia followed, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous stone hall. Banners bearing the Blackwood wolf hung from the high, beamed ceiling, faded and ancient. Suits of armor stood like silent sentinels along the walls. The air was cold, filled with the scent of wood smoke and age. There were no flowers, no feminine touches. This was a bastion of masculinity, a place that had been without a duchess for a very long time. Mrs. Gable stopped before a pair of immense wooden doors. "The Duke is within." She did not knock, but opened one of the doors and stood aside. Aurelia took a breath and walked into the wolf's den. The study was a vast room, lined from floor to ceiling with books. A fire roared in a fireplace large enough to roast an ox, casting flickering shadows across the room, and before it, a man stood with his back to her, staring into the flames. He was huge. Even from across the room she could see the sheer breadth of his shoulders, the power in his stance. He wore no formal coat, just dark trousers and a white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms. He did not turn when she entered. "You came," he said. His voice was a low rumble like distant thunder. It held no surprise, only a statement of fact. "You gave me little choice, Your Grace," she replied, her own voice steadier than she felt. He turned then, and she finally saw him. The rumors had not done him justice. He was not merely large, he was formidable. His face was all harsh angles and planes, a face that belonged on a Roman coin. Dark hair, streaked with silver at the temples, fell across a broad forehead, but it was his eyes that held her. They were a startling, pale gray, the color of a winter sky, and they were filled with a deep, weary intelligence. They looked at her, truly looked, taking in her plain dress, her tired face, and her braced posture. His gaze dropped for a moment to her feet, then rose back to her face. There was no pity in it, no disdain, only observation. "No," he said, a faint, wry twist to his lips. "I suppose I did not." He gestured to a chair near the fire. Please, sit. You must be exhausted. She moved to the chair, conscious of his eyes on her. She sat, the warmth of the fire a welcome relief. He remained standing, a towering presence that dominated the room. The registrar is in the village, he said, getting straight to the point. He will be here in the morning, a parson as well. It will be quiet, just us, the staff, as witnesses. As you wish, Your Grace. A silence fell between them, broken only by the crackle of the fire. It was not awkward, but heavy, filled with the unspoken terms of their arrangement. I have 3 sons, he said abruptly, as if remembering a crucial detail. Thomas is 12, Julian is 9, Leo is 6. The letter mentioned them. They are a challenge, he admitted. Their mother died giving birth to Leo. They have been without a woman's influence for their entire lives, or for most of them. They are more wolf cub than boy. A pang of something, not quite pity, but a kind of pained empathy, touched her. 3 motherless boys raised in this stone fortress by a grieving, distant father. I will do my best to be what they need, she said quietly. He looked at her again, a long, searching look. Why did you agree to this, Lady Aurelia? Truly, you could have weathered the storm in London. Your family has money. She met his gaze without flinching. Because I do not wish to merely weather storms, Your Grace. I wish to be the one who decides when the rain falls. Your proposal offered me a title and a fortress. Viscount Sterling offered me a cage decorated with his mother's approval. I have discovered I have no taste for cages. For the first time, a genuine, startlingly attractive smile touched his lips. It transformed his harsh face, warming it from the inside out. Good, he said, the word a low growl of approval. Then we will suit. He crossed the room to a large decanter and poured 2 glasses of what looked like brandy. He handed one to her. To our arrangement, then. May it be a profitable one for us both. She took the glass. The spirit was strong, burning a warm path down her throat. To our arrangement, she echoed. The next morning she became the Duchess of Blackwood in a short, stark ceremony in the castle's ancient chapel. Her only attendants were the grim Mrs. Gable and a stoic butler. The Duke stood beside her, his presence a solid wall of heat and strength. He spoke his vows in that deep, rumbling voice, his pale eyes fixed on her face. When he slid the ring onto her finger, it was not a delicate band of gold, but a heavy, ancient signet ring bearing the wolf's head crest. It was cold and weighty, a symbol of power and responsibility. A manacle of a different sort, perhaps, but one she had chosen. When the parson pronounced them man and wife, the Duke did not kiss her. He simply took her hand, his large, warm fingers closing around hers. Welcome to Blackwood, Your Grace, he said, his voice formal once more, and then he led her from the chapel, not to a wedding breakfast, but to meet her new sons. They were waiting in the grand hall, standing in a line like prisoners awaiting judgment. Thomas, the eldest, was a miniature version of his father, tall for his age, with the same serious set to his jaw and watchful grey eyes. Julian, the middle boy, had a shock of unruly dark hair and a glint of mischief in his eyes that was at odds with his formal posture. And then there was Leo, the youngest. He was small, with wide, curious eyes and a thumb stuck firmly in his mouth. Aurelia's heart, which she had thought frozen solid, gave a painful lurch. They were so young and so alone. The Duke's hand was still on her arm, a steadying presence. Boys, he said, his voice softer than she had yet heard it. This is Lady Aurelia. She is to be your new mother. She is the Duchess of Blackwood. Thomas gave a stiff, formal bow. Your Grace. Julian fidgeted, kicking at an imaginary stone on the floor. Leo simply stared, his big eyes taking in every detail of her face, her dress, and then, inevitably, her posture. He took his thumb out of his mouth. Why do you walk like that? He asked, his child's voice brutally, innocently direct. The air went still. Mrs. Gable, standing in the background, drew in a sharp breath. Thomas shot his younger brother a furious look. Even the Duke seemed to tense, his grip on her arm tightening for a fraction of a second. This was it, the moment of truth. In London, a question like that would have been met with horrified shushing and embarrassed glances. It would have been another small cut, another reminder of her defect. Aurelia looked down at the small, curious face. She saw no malice there, only genuine inquiry. She disengaged her arm from the Duke's and took a slow, deliberate step toward the boy. She knelt before him, a movement that was awkward and cost her a twinge of pain, bringing herself down to his level. The heavy ducal ring felt cold against her skin. When I was a little girl, a bit older than you, I fell from a horse, she said, her voice soft and clear. My leg was badly broken, and the doctor who fixed it was not very clever, so it healed in a way that makes me walk a little differently from other people. It does not hurt most of the time, but it is a part of me, like the color of your eyes." Leo considered this with the profound seriousness of a 6-year-old philosopher. He looked at her leg, then back at her face. "Does it mean you cannot run?" "I cannot run very fast," she admitted, "but I can walk for miles, and I can ride very well, and I can read stories better than anyone you have ever met." A flicker of interest. "Even stories about dragons?" "Especially stories about dragons," she confirmed. A tiny smile touched his lips. He seemed to have reached a decision. He stepped forward and placed his small, slightly sticky hand in hers. "All right then," he said, as if giving her his official seal of approval. From the corner of her eye, she saw the tension leave the Duke's shoulders. He looked down at her, kneeling on the cold stone floor in her simple wool dress, her hand in his son's, and the expression on his face was one she could not decipher. It was a complex mixture of surprise, relief, and something else, something deeper and more vulnerable that was gone as quickly as it appeared. Life at Blackwood was a routine of quiet days and long, silent evenings. The castle was a world unto itself, a kingdom of stone and shadow. Aurelia quickly learned its rhythms. The Duke was an elusive presence. He spent his days in his study or riding out across his vast lands, managing the complex machinery of his estate. He was a good landlord, she learned from the whispers of the staff. He was fair, just, and utterly unapproachable. They took their meals together, the four of them, in a dining hall so vast their small table seemed like a raft in a dark ocean. The conversations were stilted. The Duke would ask his sons about their tutors, his questions formal and detached. Thomas would answer in monosyllables. Julian would try to make a joke, which would invariably fall flat. Leo would mostly just eat. Aurelia was the interloper, the stranger at the feast. She tried to draw the boys out, asking them about their interests, their games, their lives. Julian was the easiest to win over. He was hungry for attention and responded to her questions with an explosion of stories about his latest schemes and adventures. Thomas remained aloof, his gray eyes watching her with a silent, guarded suspicion. He had loved his mother fiercely, Mrs. Gable told her in a rare moment of confidence, and he saw Aurelia as a usurper. Her relationship with the Duke was the strangest of all. They were husband and wife in name only. They occupied separate wings of the castle. He was unfailingly polite, his courtesy a cold, polished wall between them. He treated her with the formal respect due to her title, but there was no warmth, no intimacy. He was holding to the letter of their contract. He had given her his name and his protection. He had not promised her his company. She did not mind the distance. It gave her space to heal. The raw wound of her humiliation began to scar over in the quiet solitude of Blackwood. Here, her limp was a matter of fact, not a matter of commentary. The staff, following the lead of their master, treated her with a deference that had nothing to do with her appearance. She was the Duchess, and that was all that mattered. She found her purpose in the small details of running the household. Mrs. Gable, initially hostile, began to thaw as she realized Aurelia had no intention of usurping her authority, but rather sought to learn from her. Aurelia discovered that the castle, for all its grandeur, was a place of neglect. The gardens were overgrown, the library was thick with dust, and the rooms in the family wing were cheerless and stark. She began slowly to make changes. She did not ask the Duke's permission. Their contract had stipulated that she be the chatelaine of his home, and she took him at his word. She hired more gardeners and set them to work reclaiming the beautiful terraced gardens that tumbled down the hillside below the castle. She spent days in the library, cataloguing the thousands of books, the scent of old paper and leather a balm to her soul. She discovered a forgotten collection of children's books and brought them to the nursery, which she had aired out and filled with new rugs and curtains. One afternoon she was in the library, perched on a ladder to reach a high shelf, when the Duke entered. He stopped, watching her. "I see you have made yourself at home," he said. The words were neutral, but she detected a note of something else beneath them. She looked down at him. "This is my home, Your Grace. I am simply making it habitable." "It was habitable before." "It was a fortress," she countered, not backing down. "A home requires light, and less dust." He walked over to a table where she had laid out a series of botanical prints she had found in a dusty portfolio. He picked one up, a delicate rendering of a wild orchid. "My first wife, Elara, drew these." It was the first time he had mentioned her. The name hung in the air between them. They are beautiful, Aurelia said softly. They should be framed and hung, not left to rot in a drawer. He looked from the drawing to her, and that unreadable expression was back in his eyes. She loved the gardens. She would have liked what you are doing with them. He placed the drawing carefully back on the table. As you were, Your Grace. He turned and left as silently as he had come, leaving her alone on the ladder with a racing heart. It was not a conversation, not really, but it was a crack in the wall. Her biggest challenge and her greatest joy became the boys. She kept her promise to Leo and read to him every night before bed. His initial demand for dragon stories soon expanded to tales of knights, explorers, and mischievous animals. Julian, drawn by the sound of her voice, started to join them, curling up at the foot of Leo's bed. Soon their bedtime story became a ritual. Thomas remained a fortress, much like his father. He would not join the story sessions. He was polite but distant, his grief a shield she could not seem to penetrate. One day she found him in the mews, watching the falconer work with a young hawk. He stood with a longing on his face that was painful to see. "He is a beautiful bird," she said, coming to stand beside him. She did not startle him. Her uneven gait always announced her arrival. "He is a peregrine," Thomas said, not looking at her. "The fastest animal on earth." "I used to ride," she said quietly. "Before my accident, I missed the feeling of moving fast, the wind in your face." He glanced at her then, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "You can still ride." "I can," she agreed. "But it is not the same. I cannot gallop across an open field without a care. I have to be more careful now." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the hawk circle in the sky. "My mother taught me to ride," he said, the words so quiet she almost missed them. She was not careful. She was like the wind. Here it was, the heart of his pain. "I am not your mother, Thomas," she said gently. "I will never try to be, but I would be honored to be your friend." He did not reply, but he did not walk away either. They stood together for a long time, watching the hawk, a boy and a woman, two lonely souls, finding a moment of common ground in the shadow of a shared loss. Weeks turned into months. A fragile peace settled over Blackwood. The gardens began to bloom under Aurelia's care. The castle felt less like a tomb and more like a home. The Duke remained a distant star in her firmament, a powerful presence she orbited but never touched. They continued their formal dinners, their polite exchanges. He never entered her wing of the castle, she never entered his. It was a strange, chaste marriage, a partnership of paper and title, not of flesh and heart. Yet things were changing in subtle ways. She found a new, exquisitely carved walking cane made of dark, polished oak left just outside her door one morning. It was perfectly weighted, the handle smooth and shaped to her hand. There was no note, but she knew it was from him. She started using it, and the added support eased the strain on her leg, allowing her to walk in the gardens for longer. She noticed that benches began to appear along the garden paths, placed in just the right spots to offer a rest with a beautiful view. Again, no words were exchanged, but she knew. He was watching her. He was seeing her. One evening, a packet of letters arrived from London. The Duke brought them to her in the library where she was reading. He placed them on the table beside her and lingered, an unusual hesitation in his manner. "There is news from London," he said. She looked at the letters but did not reach for them. News from that world felt like a message from a foreign country she had once visited long ago. "Good news, I hope?" A grim smile touched his lips. "That depends on your perspective. Viscount Sterling has been ruined." Aurelia froze. "Ruined? How?" "It seems he was engaged in a series of highly unwise financial speculations," the Duke explained, his voice smooth as silk. "And he was keeping a mistress, an opera dancer, in a style far beyond his means. Someone brought these facts to the attention of his primary creditors, all at once. They called in his debts. His family has been forced to sell their country estate and half their holdings. They are socially finished." She stared at him, at his calm, pale eyes, and she understood. "Someone?" she repeated softly. "A concerned citizen," he said, his expression giving nothing away. "One who believes that arrogance and cruelty should have a price." He paused. "I thought you should know. The debt is paid." He had done it for her. This cold, distant man had reached out from his northern fortress and systematically destroyed the man who had humiliated her. It was not a gift of flowers or a whispered endearment. It was an act of brutal, calculated vengeance on her behalf. It was the most romantic thing anyone had ever done for her. Thank you, she whispered, the words inadequate. He gave a slight formal nod. As I said in my letter, Your Grace, we are partners. Your enemies are my enemies. He turned to leave, but hesitated at the door. Sterling's folly was in underestimating you. It is a mistake I do not intend to make. He left her there, surrounded by the quiet hum of 1,000 books, her heart beating a wild, unfamiliar rhythm. He was not just her protector, he was her champion. And she was beginning to realize that the stone fortress of Blackwood was not a prison. It was a sanctuary she had started to love, and its master, the cold, reclusive Duke, was a man of hidden depths and surprising fire. A man she was beginning to care for far more than their contract required. The first snows of winter began to dust the high peaks around Blackwood, and a new, more intimate quiet settled over the castle. The revelation of the Duke's quiet vengeance had shifted something fundamental between them. The wall of cold courtesy remained, but now Aurelia could see the cracks in it, could sense the heat radiating from within. She found herself watching him during their silent dinners, studying the way his strong hands held a wineglass, the rare fleeting smiles that touched his lips when Leo said something particularly absurd. Her feelings for him were a confusing tangle of gratitude, respect, and a burgeoning, terrifying tenderness. He was her husband. The word was a strange, ill-fitting garment. Their marriage was a business arrangement, and yet she was beginning to wish it were more. She saw the loneliness in his eyes, the deep, weary sorrow that he carried like a cloak, and she longed to offer him comfort, not as his duchess, but as his wife. The catalyst for change came, as it so often did, in the form of a child. One night, a storm raged outside, a furious northern gale that hammered at the stone walls and shrieked through the battlements. Aurelia was in her sitting room, reading by the fire, when a frantic knock came at her door. It was Julian, his face pale with panic, his nightshirt askew. "It's Leo," he gasped. "He's sick. He's burning up, and he's making a funny noise when he breathes." Aurelia was on her feet in an instant, her book forgotten. She grabbed her new cane and followed Julian as he ran down the cold, drafty corridors to the nursery wing. She found Leo thrashing in his bed, his face flushed with fever, his breath coming in short, rasping pants. A terrible barking cough echoed in the room. Mrs. Gable was already there, trying to soothe him with a cool cloth, her usual composure gone, replaced by a worried frown. "It's the croup," the housekeeper said, her voice tight. "My nephew had it. It can be dangerous." Just then, the Duke appeared in the doorway, drawn by the commotion. He was in his shirt sleeves, his hair disheveled, a look of sharp alarm on his face. He took in the scene in a single glance, his eyes locking on his youngest son. The mask of the detached patriarch fell away, revealing the raw fear of a father. "What is it?" he demanded, his voice rough. "The croup, Your Grace," Mrs. Gable repeated. He strode to the bed, placing a hand on Leo's forehead. He swore under his breath. "He's on fire. Send for Dr. Murray." "A rider has already been sent," Mrs. Gable assured him. "But with this storm, it could be hours before he can get through from the village." Hours. Aurelia looked at the struggling child, his small chest heaving. They might not have hours. She remembered something from her own childhood, a remedy an old groom had used for a stable boy with the same affliction. It was a desperate old wives' tale, but they were in a desperate situation. "We need to get steam into his lungs," she said, her voice cutting through the panic in the room. Both the Duke and Mrs. Gable turned to look at her. "It will loosen the phlegm and help him breathe." "Steam?" the Duke asked, skeptical. "In the bathing chamber," she said, her mind working quickly. "The small one. Off your own suite. It's the most enclosed. We can seal the door. Have the servants bring every kettle and pot of boiling water they can carry. We can turn it into a steam room." The Duke stared at her for a moment, his pale eyes searching her face. He saw not panic, but a focused, determined calm. He made a decision. "Do it," he said to Mrs. Gable. "Now, everyone, move." The castle, which usually slept in silence, exploded into quiet, efficient action. Servants scurried through the halls with steaming kettles. The Duke, without a word, lifted his sick child from the bed, wrapping him tightly in a thick wool blanket. Leo coughed weakly against his father's broad chest. "I will carry him," he said. Aurelia nodded, grabbing a lamp. "This way." She led him through the labyrinthine corridors to his own wing of the castle, a place she had never been. His rooms were Spartan, masculine, dominated by a large, unadorned bed and shelves of books on agriculture and history. He followed her into the adjoining bathing chamber, a small room tiled in dark green stone. Servants were already pouring water into the large copper tub, and the air was beginning to fill with a thick, humid fog. "Put a towel under the door," Aurelia commanded a young maid. "We need to trap every bit of it." Soon the room was a dense cloud of steam. The Duke sat on a small stool, holding Leo on his lap, his large frame hunched over the small, bundled form. Aurelia knelt before them, her dress already damp, her hair curling in the humidity. She placed a hand on Leo's back, feeling the frantic vibration of his struggles for air. "It's all right, Leo," she murmured, her voice a low, soothing hum. "Breathe the warm air, just breathe." For what felt like an eternity, they sat in the suffocating heat, the only sounds the hiss of the steam and Leo's ragged breathing. The Duke did not speak. His entire being was focused on the child in his arms, his face a mask of iron control that could not quite conceal the terror beneath. Aurelia kept talking, a steady stream of nonsense and comfort, her hand never leaving Leo's back. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, a change began to occur. The rasping in Leo's chest seemed to lessen. The frantic, panicked edge to his breathing softened. The terrible, barking cough became looser, more productive. Finally, after a long, shuddering sigh, he relaxed against his father's chest, his breathing deepening into the steady rhythm of true sleep. The silence in the room was profound. The Duke looked down at his sleeping son, then raised his eyes to Aurelia. In the dim, misty light, she saw the raw, unguarded emotion on his face, the fear, the relief, the exhaustion. "You saved him," he said, his voice thick. "We saved him," she corrected gently. "And an old wives' tale." He reached out his free hand, not to her arm but to her face. His calloused fingers gently brushed a damp strand of hair from her cheek. The touch was electric, a jolt of warmth and connection that went straight to her core. It was the first time he had touched her with anything other than cold formality. It was a touch that spoke of gratitude, of partnership, of something more. "Aurelia," he said, and the sound of her name on his lips, spoken without a title, was an intimacy that made her heart ache. They remained like that for a moment, suspended in the steam and the silence, a man, a woman, and a sleeping child. The storm outside still raged, but inside their small, warm world, a different kind of storm had just broken. By the time Dr. Murray arrived hours later, his face ruddy from the wind, Leo was sleeping peacefully in his own bed, his breathing easy and clear. The doctor examined him, listened to his chest, and pronounced him out of danger. "The steam was exactly the right thing to do, Your Grace," he said, looking at Aurelia with newfound respect. Quick thinking, it likely prevented a much more serious outcome. The Duke, standing by the fireplace, simply nodded, his eyes on Aurelia. After the doctor left, a weary quiet descended. Mrs. Gable shooed the other boys back to bed and insisted on sitting with Leo herself for the rest of the night. The Duke walked with Aurelia from the nursery. The corridors were silent again. The castle returned to its slumber. When they reached the junction where their wings diverged, he did not bid her a formal good night. He stopped, turning to face her fully. "I have been a fool," he said, the words stark in the quiet hall. "Your Grace?" "My name is Alistair," he said, his voice low and intense. "I would have you use it." He took a step closer, and the space between them seemed to crackle with unspoken energy. "I offered you a contract, Aurelia, a partnership of convenience. I thought that was all I had left to give. I thought this," he gestured around at the stone walls, "was all I was, a fortress, a title, a duty." He looked down at her, his pale eyes burning with an emotion she had never seen in him before. "Tonight I watched you save my son. You did it not out of duty, but out of a kindness and strength that I have kept at arm's length because I was afraid of it. My first marriage, it ended in grief. I locked myself away so I would never feel that kind of loss again. In doing so, I have starved my sons of warmth, and I have starved myself of life." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing with hers. The ducal ring she wore was cold, but his hand was warm. "I do not want a duchess of convenience," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I want a wife. I want you, Aurelia, if you will have me, not as a duke, but as a man." The breath caught in her throat. This was it. The confession she had secretly longed for but never dared to expect. The walls were finally, truly down. She saw him not as the formidable Duke of Blackwood, but as Alistair, a man marked by sorrow, a father terrified for his child, a husband reaching for a connection he had denied himself for years. Her own fear, the fear of being hurt again, of being found wanting, melted away in the heat of his gaze. She had come to Blackwood seeking sanctuary from a broken heart, and in the process she had found a place and a man she could not bear to lose. "I am already your wife, Alistair," she whispered, her fingers tightening around his. "I think I have been waiting for you to be my husband." A slow, wondrous smile spread across his face, the real, unguarded smile she had seen only once before. It lit him from within, chasing away the last of the shadows. He raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, a gesture of profound, reverent tenderness. "Then come," he said softly. "Come to my rooms, not as a guest, as my wife." He led her not to her own wing, but to his. This time when she entered his chambers, it was not as a stranger in a crisis, but as a partner stepping over a threshold into a new life. He closed the door behind them, shutting out the castle, the titles, the world. There was no contract between them now, only a quiet, powerful understanding. In the heart of the cold stone fortress, a marriage of convenience was about to become a marriage of the heart. The year that followed was one of quiet transformation. The marriage that had begun as a stark contract, a transaction of needs, slowly, patiently bloomed into love. Alistair, having opened the door to his heart, did not close it again. The gruff, distant Duke was replaced by a man of surprising warmth and attentiveness. He began to spend his evenings not in his solitary study, but with her, in the library she had brought back to life. They would read in comfortable silence, the only sound the turning of pages and the crackle of the fire, but it was a shared silence, a comfortable intimacy that spoke more than words. He courted her, not with the grand, empty gestures of a London suitor, but with small, meaningful acts that showed he saw her, truly saw her. He learned which flowers she loved and had them planted in a private walled garden only they could access. He noticed her interest in the estate's management and began to discuss his plans with her, valuing her sharp, intelligent insights. He treated her not just as his duchess, but as his confidant and his equal. Her relationship with the boys deepened into a genuine maternal love. Julian remained her devoted shadow, Leo her sweet-natured companion. Even Thomas, the last holdout, finally lowered his defenses. The turning point came on a bright spring morning when Aurelia, feeling stronger and more confident than she had in years, had a groom saddle a gentle mare for her. As she rode out, Thomas fell into step beside her on his own pony. They rode for an hour without speaking, simply enjoying the rhythm of the horses and the fresh, clean air. "You ride well," he said finally, a grudging compliment. "I love it," she replied simply. "It is the one time I feel truly free, almost like flying." He looked at her, at the way she sat her horse, her back straight, her hands gentle on the reins. He saw not a replacement for his mother, but a different woman entirely, one who had her own quiet strength, her own kind of grace. "Father is different now," he said, the observation abrupt. "He smiles more." "Yes," Aurelia said softly. "He does." "It is because of you," Thomas stated, a fact, not an accusation. He was silent for another moment. "I am glad you are here." The words, so simple and so hard-won, were more precious to Aurelia than any jewel. She had not conquered the fortress of Blackwood. She had been welcomed into it. She had found her family. Alistair, for his part, was a man reborn. The love he had for Aurelia overflowed into his relationship with his sons. The formal, stilted dinners disappeared, replaced by lively, often chaotic meals filled with laughter and argument. He taught Julian to fish in the river, he spent hours helping Thomas with his Latin, and he never once missed reading a bedtime story with Aurelia to Leo. He was learning to be a father again, not just a guardian. One summer afternoon, nearly a year after her arrival, Aurelia was walking in the newly blooming gardens. The path was smooth, and she barely needed her cane, her gait more fluid and confident than it had been in years. The sun was warm on her face, and the air was thick with the scent of roses and honeysuckle. She found Alistair and the boys near the ancient sundial at the center of the garden. Alistair was holding Leo up to read the carved Latin motto. Julian was attempting to climb the sundial itself, and Thomas was trying to pull him down. It was a scene of perfect, happy chaos. Alistair looked up and saw her approaching. The smile that lit his face was one of pure, uncomplicated love. He set Leo down and came to meet her, taking her hand. "Look at what you have done," he said, his voice a low, contented rumble. He gestured to the vibrant flowers, the laughing boys, the sunlit warmth that seemed to permeate the very stones of the castle. "You brought the light back to Blackwood, Aurelia." "I did not," she said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "The light was always here. It was just waiting for someone to open the curtains." He wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her close. Leo, seeing his parents together, ran over and threw his arms around both their legs. "Mother! Father!" he chirped happily. Aurelia looked at her husband, at her son, at the home she had built from the ashes of her deepest humiliation. The memory of St. George's Church, of Viscount Stirling's cruelty, of her father's shame, felt like a story about someone else. The limp that had defined and constrained her for so long was now just a part of her, a footnote in the story of her life, not its title. Alistair had not erased her flaw, he had simply made it irrelevant. He had seen past the imperfection to the person, and in doing so, he had given her the one thing she had never known she was missing. Not a title, not a fortune, but the profound, unshakable knowledge that she was loved, completely and unconditionally, not in spite of her scars, but with them. "I love you, Alistair Beaumont," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion so deep it was almost painful. He bent his head and kissed her. A long, slow kiss full of promise and contentment, right there in the sunlight, surrounded by their children and the life they had built together. "And I love you, my fierce, brave Duchess," he murmured against her lips, "more than you will ever know." The black carriage had brought her to a fortress to escape a ruin, but it was here in the arms of the reclusive Duke and his 3 wild sons that she had finally, truly found her home.